Hello, and welcome to another episode of Physical Format Rock and Roll, where we talk about all things rock and roll and classic metal. I'm Gary. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to do new album review, although technically this is far from being a new album. It's a reissue. And what we're talking about today is the Yardbirds. And this is the Record Store Day reissue or exclusive, whatever you want to call it, of Roger the Engineer. So anytime you talk about the Yardbirds, it's always kind of a mess because of the way everything was released in England and then over here in the States and other different countries. So it gets a little confusing. And this album was actually released in July of 1966. And in England, it was simply called the Yardbirds. And over here, it was called Over, Under, Sideways, Down, which was a single that they had released a couple months before the album came out. So they figured that would go over well, calling it that in England. And then eventually, even though it was never technically called this in England, but it has become known as Roger the Engineer. Okay, it has been released at different times throughout history. As I know that my original copy that I had sitting over here, this is what I did have before. As you can see, the cover is not in great shape. The record itself is in pretty good shape. And I thought for a long time that this was actually like an original copy from the 60s, but it's not. This was actually released in the early 80s. So that's what that is. So I had that, and I was kind of excited when I saw that this was going to be a Record Store Day exclusive. What this does is kind of it has the different versions that were put out. The band at this time during this recording was Keith Relf, of course, on vocals and harmonica, pretty good harmonica player, by the way. Chris Deja who plays rhythm guitar, Paul Samuel Smith on bass, and Jim McCarty, of course, on drums, and Jeff Beck on lead guitar. Now, the Yardbirds were always the kind of, redheaded stepchild to the Beatles and the Stones and the Who, the bands like that. They were never nearly as big as any of those bands, but they did definitely make their stamp on history, most notably because of the guitar players that played in this band. Starting out with Slow Hand himself, Eric Clapton, when they were mostly just a blues band doing blues covers. And then, after he decided to leave because they had a hit of the song For Your Love, which I love that song, Clapton didn't like that. He thought it was too poppy. He thought he was a blues purist at the time, even though not too long after that he would be in the band Cream. So in comes Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck actually was not who the Yardbirds originally sought. They went after Jimmy Page, but Page at that time was not interested in touring. He was doing mostly session work and making a pretty good living at doing that. So he suggested his friend Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck joins. Probably this is the most prolific time period for the Yardbirds. Jimmy Page would later take over for Jeff Beck when Jeff Beck left during a tour. That was a short-lived time. They did record the album Little Games with Jimmy Page, which is kind of a mishmash. Was hurriedly done and kind of a mess. It did have some good songs on it. And then, as most of you know, the Yardbirds ended up transforming into a little band called Led Zeppelin. Pretty much every other band member was gone except for Jimmy Page. He owned the name. They had a contract where he had to play some dates some Scandinavian dates as the Yardbirds. They called themselves the New Yardbirds. That's where he got the other members, Led Zeppelin in, and then of course they changed the name to Led Zeppelin. But anyway, enough of that, back to this. So this is a special reissue. It doesn't really have a whole lot as far as like bonus things in here. It did come with this. It's got some quotes from band members at the time, and it's it's interesting, but I don't know. I feel like it could have had a little bit more in there. I like it when records get reissued and whatnot, when they have little bonuses in them, whether they're posters or more booklets, things like that. That would have been nice, because like I said, the Yardbirds, it's always a scattered deal of what's going on there. So anyway, this album has two records. It's a double record, and they're both 180 heavyweight vinyl. They're pretty cool, the white looking records. One of them is in stereo and the other's in mono. Most of the songs are the same. They have the original release songs, and then they have like some of the bonus ones. Like I said, this album has been chopped up and whatnot over the years. So the mono version also has the songs Happening 10 Years Time Ago and Psycho Daisies. That's in mono, both of which are the only songs that had Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck together. So, I mean, really it's worth it just for that, in my mind. I would recommend this album to definitely anybody who's already kind of into the Yardbirds. Maybe you've got a greatest hits and you want to get further into it. I would definitely pick this up. This is the only Yardbirds album where it's all original materials. All their other albums that they had released always had, cover versions and things like that. This is, there's definitely, you can tell that there's times on here, hey, these guys were in the studio, what do you want to do? There's some experimental stuff. Some of it works. Some of it is really cool. It's kind of an all over the place album, like the Yardbirds were. They had like these straight blues songs. They had some psychedelic songs. They had some folk sounding songs that really, it's kind of hard to describe. I know one of the songs that actually got me into the Yardbirds, when I first heard them, I got a cassette that was a European cassette that was in some cutout bin. So the recordings weren't very good, but it had definitely a mishmash of music in there. And one of the songs was Still I'm Sad. And, that has those chants going through the song. If you've never heard it, look that one up. And that song kind of got me hooked. I'm like, wow, these guys are really odd. And of course, I bought it because I was already a Zeppelin fan at that time, and I knew that Page, had something to do with the Yardbirds. So I bought that. I would recommend, actually, and if you've never bought anything by the Yardbirds, you've never heard them, I would recommend one of their greatest hits. This is one of their early ones, a version from the 60s. So it's got Shape of Things on here, which Jeff Beck would end up redoing on one of his early solo albums. Still I'm Sad, New York City Blues, For Your Love, Over, Under, Sideways, Down, I'm a Man, Happening 10 Years Time Ago, Heart Full of Soul, that's a great song. Smokestack Lightning, which is, of course, a remake, and I'm Not Talking. So I would recommend one of those, but if you're a little more, into music and you don't have this one, I would recommend this. Like I said, it's got some oddball stuff on it. but it's definitely worth listening to if you're a Yardbirds fan or getting into them more so. Another cool thing about it is it has a song on here called The Naz Are Blue. And if you're not familiar with that, it actually has Jeff Beck on lead vocals doing that song and playing guitar. I don't know if I said it already, but this is the only album by the Yardbirds where Jeff Beck plays guitar on every song. So it's worth it for that. Jeff Beck, one of the greatest guitar players of all time. And you get to hear his very early work, during the 60s. Of course, he's not as prolific at that time as he, would become later, but there's still a lot of really good guitar work. And like I said, to hear Happening 10 Years Time Ago and Psycho Daisies, where you have Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page on the same songs, they're not, there's not a whole lot of crazy guitar work in there, but still just the fact that both of them are on there is pretty cool. Happening 10 Years Time Ago, I saw one time at some list was listed as the top psychedelic song of all time. So there you go. It was really cool. Another thing, the reason this ended up being called Roger the Engineer, this drawing that's on there, which maybe you can see it better on this, that was actually drawn by Chris Reissue, which I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. I'm sure someone will correct me. But the rhythm guitar player and one of the leaders of the Yardbirds, wrote a lot of the songs. But he drew that of Roger Cameron, who was the sound engineer on this album. That was a doodle that he had drawn, and then they used it for a cover and started calling it Roger the Engineer. So that's the origin of that. This album was produced by Simon Napier Bell and Paul Samwell Smith, the bass player. So it's got a good mid-60s sound. From 1966, you got to think of everything that was going on, like with the Beatles and the Stones, how music was changing and how it was getting ready to really change over the next couple years. And this album is right there with some of the changes that's going on. Like I said, it's a very odd album. I think it's probably overlooked in the history of music. It's I'm sure the Yardbirds were very influential on a lot of different people, different acts. For one that comes top of my mind is Aerosmith. They were influenced by the Yardbirds. But anyway, this is a good sounding record. I like the stereo recording better than I do the mono recording. But both sound pretty good. It's nice to have a nice new clean copy of it. So Yardbirds, Roger the Engineer, I would recommend going out and getting it if you want to get into the Yardbirds. If you're just, you're not into the Yardbirds at all, you just want to hear, get a feel for them, definitely get one of the greatest hits. They have probably 4 or 5 different greatest hits albums out there. So choose one of those. I'm Gary, and this has been another episode of Physical Format Rock and Roll. I would appreciate any comments that you would like to make. Share some of your Yardbird stories or whatever. And if you would subscribe to this channel, that would be fantastic. Until the next time.